Buddy. How you doing today? Well, it's the first time I've seen blue sky in a week or so because of the smoke. I'm grateful for it. And I was going to go on a little trip down to the river maybe later with a buddy of mine and take the kids. And before I did, I thought I would make a brief video, something I was thinking about this morning. And the thing was about division, and how we got here in division. I'm kind of fascinated by psychology and human nature and how we can draw conclusions and create fallacies, and when I'm doing it or anyone else is doing it in our own minds. But I wanted to look back on times in our country's history when we've been divided against ourselves. And so I'm going to briefly go through the list that I came up with. And the first, we'll start with colonialism, obviously. In the Boston Tea Party, the various early parts of our country, there was a lot of let's just say dislike for the colonial, the colonists and people who, even though we were colonists over here, we wanted freedom. We wanted to do things differently. So we came to America. But even within the early groups, there was civil disturbances, basically like civil strife and war. I mean, the early history of, fighting with the British, but also infighting within colonies here in the U.S., goes back to, there was a lot of propaganda that got people to believe the other side was really the enemy, when a lot of the times everybody wanted the same thing. If we move forward a little bit, and around the same time, it was the savages, as they called them. Whether you want to call them Native Americans or Indians, the fact that people already lived here in the millions, there was tons of propaganda put out to make it seem like, even to this day, that less Indians lived here than actually did, and that within those groups, they were all out to get blood from the white man. And it was ridiculous. But that's the kind of propaganda and infighting. And instead of in making an inclusive nation where we could work together, we made them out to be the enemy. And bloodshed ensued, and we look back on that with horror in a lot of ways. Fast forward a little bit, when the U.S. got into the war with Mexico, a lot of Americans were told by Mexico, you can come settle on our land as long as you follow by these certain rules. Well, the Americans all settled on this land and decided, well, we don't want to follow your rules. We want to take this area for ourselves. And therefore there was a war, and the U.S. took Texas, relatively in a nutshell. And during that time, they made out Mexicans to be the enemy. And they created all this propaganda about, how Mexicans were all bad and we deserve this land more than they do. So move forward a little further, and we have minorities wanting rights, minorities wanting just basic human rights, and propaganda once against minorities, but not just not just blacks or Mexicans or anyone else. It was actually women who the whole time, but they wanted just the simple right to vote and suffrage. And women were made out. Some of the articles about women were just horrible, saying that they have no clue, they would never be able to vote or know what they're talking about. They're not worldly enough, they're too hysterical. And so women's rights and minority rights kind of went hand in hand, and a lot of people were made out to be, the enemy, because it's easier than giving people equality. Then after a time, again, civil rights came up, but around the same time, the hippie movement, or the 60s. And look at what they did to the hippies. They smeared them as communists. They were all out to destroy the country. Hippies want all your kids to drop out of school and never do anything. And if hippies are allowed to flourish and LSD is allowed to stay legal, then this whole world's going to come to an end. The things that they would say about hippies were just so ludicrous. But, around the same time we had nuclear weapons, and so we would make out other countries, to be this big threat. Now, this is true in a sense. So this is one of the actual threats that we really had, was a nuclear annihilation. But by calling hippies and others communists, they could basically label them along with these people that wanted to destroy our country. And it worked, propaganda works. So I want to get to the last three most important ones, which are the ones in the modern day, our new boogeymen. And, when I was in my 20s, it was terrorism. And we were always under a constant threat of terrorist attacks. And you know what? A lot of these were credible threats. regardless of why. The fact that the U.S. imposes policies on other countries is not the point. The point is that people are trying to destroy us because they're angry at us. Therefore, it was a legitimate concern, but that was played up and used as an excuse to tap into Americans' phones and emails and histories and basically say, well, the Patriot Act allows Americans to lose all their rights just to protect against terrorism. And a majority of Americans said we don't want to give up those rights, but they did anyway. And that's an example of how using terrorism to make it a bigger threat than it really is in order to take away rights. And the same thing happened a little further, even in recent years. Think about it. We made the new enemies. There are a ton of enemies. The migrant caravans. So all immigrants are horrible. And all of a sudden there's all this hatred. The China virus. So all of a sudden China's the big enemy. But now, Democrats. Democrats are the new enemy, the new scapegoat, the new ones who want to burn down the country, the communists, socialists. And who knows what tomorrow the new scapegoat will be. I have no idea. I mean, I don't know where we're going to go from here. This is not intended to be a poke at either side politically, nor even just political, but to look at the history of America and how we have divided ourselves. And when we look back in retrospect at a lot of these times, we find that we were wrong or overzealous in our thoughts about how bad the enemy really was and how threatening they really were. So, I'll talk to you later, neighbors. Be well.